It's time to actually send requests to the server and receive responses from it. First, let's begin by creating a simple request and seeing its outcome. But what are we creating the request for? You remember we had created the static list of books and had put it here in this dashboard fragment? Well, now we are going to fetch the data for this list from the API of the server and will display this data in the list. We'll go to the Android Studio and open the dashboard fragment.kt file. Inside the onCreateView method, just above this return view code, we will be sending the request. First step will be to create the request queue. This is simply a variable for storing the queue of requests. Once this is written, we will define the URL which will give us the response. This is how we will give the URL. Remember, the URL will always be a string, so don't forget the double quotes. Next, we will write this piece of code. Now let's understand what we've written here. We wrote this code and this is the syntax for the code. This is the syntax for object representation. It's a different way of making objects of a class, and the objects that are created using this syntax are known as anonymous objects. We use this syntax when we want to override the methods of a class with very few modifications. But why have we used this syntax in our code? That's because we want to use a method, getHeaders, to send headers to the API. But first let's address this question. What are headers and why do we need to send them to the API? Headers are used for various purposes in an HTTP request. It's a concept of web development and we don't need to get into much detail here. All we need to know is the purpose of headers. First, they tell us the type of content that is being sent to and received from the API. So the content can be of type JSON, PDF, plain text, image, etc. Also, they help us send a unique token with the request. This token is a unique string which will be provided to each of you in the next text chapter. This token ensures that each request we make to the API is unique. It's like your personal ID number for the request that you make. We'll learn how to send headers in a request. But before we do that, let's understand the kind of requests that can be made via the Volley library. Different types of requests can be made depending on the response we want. The two types of requests we will be looking at are JSON requests and string requests. We look at JSON requests first. Now, as the name suggests, the JSON requests are used when we want to fetch JSON responses from the server. There are again two types of JSON requests. One is a JSON object and the other is a JSON array. As you must have understood, we can fetch JSON objects from the server using this and JSON arrays using this. Now, let's see what a JSON object request looks like. As you can see, we have created a variable and given it the name JSON object request. Then in this variable, we have called the JSON object request class along with its parameters. The parameters passed here are request method, which can be get, post, etc. We will only concern ourselves with get and post in this training. Second is the URL to which the request will be sent. Next is the JSON object. So, an optional JSON object can be posted with this request. Why optional? Because we will post a JSON object when we send a post request, but this object will be null when a GET request will be sent. We know that we send a GET request when we want to get some data from the server, while we send a POST request when we want to send some data to the server, right? Hence, we need this JSON object when we send a POST request so that we can send the data in it. However, since we don't need to send any data in a GET request, this object will be empty there. Then we have the response listener, which is responsible for listening to the response sent by the server. And finally, we have the error listener, which will be responsible for any errors that might occur in this transaction. Now, let's see how a JSON array request looks like. This is it. So you see, it looks exactly the same as the JSON object request. The parameters used here are request method, just like we did for JSON object. Then we have the URL for the response, the optional JSON object, the response listener, and the error listener. For this training, we will only be using JSON object requests and will not be using this JSON array request. So, we have looked at these two types of JSON requests. Now, let's look at string requests. They are used when we want to fetch the data from the server in the form of a string. This is what a string request looks like. Again, as you can see, we have a variable and we have called the string request class here, just like we had called the JSON object request and JSON array request classes for JSON requests. Not really difficult to remember, right? The parameters being passed here are request method, which again can be get, post, etc. Then we have the URL from which the response will be fetched. And then we have the response listener and the error listener for handling responses and errors respectively. The only parameter that was there in the JSON requests and is not present in the string requests is the JSON object. In case we need to send any data to the server using string request, we need to implement a new method called getParams. Here is a learner activity for you. Check how do we send data to the server in the getParams method using string request. You can go to the search engine, type this and look for relevant results. So, we have learned about both these requests. In this training, we will only send JSON object requests. So, let's go back to the studio now and write the code for making a request. Here, we have already created a variable and called the JSON object request class. For the parameters, since we want to fetch the list of books from the API, we will send a GET request. We will give this URL for the request. We have created this URL for you. When you work on real-world projects, the web developer will give you this URL. Since it is a GET request, this JSON object will be null. And then we have the response listener and the error listener. Inside the response listener block, we will put the code for handling responses, and inside the error listener block, we will put the code for handling errors. But before we do that, let's write the code for sending headers in our request. We will use the getHeaders method to send the content of the header to the API. Let's write the code for that method now. We'll write this code for that. First, we use the getHeaders method. This is the return type of the method. So, this method will return a mutable map. Next, we create a variable and call this class hashMap. The two parameters for this class have the string data type. The two parameters are for sending the key and value. Now, if you see, we have encountered a contradiction here. This class we have inherited here returns a mutable map, but we are going to return a hashMap as we have specified here. But you need not worry about this, since a hash map is derived from a mutable map and hence both are essentially the same. Next, we have the first key, which is content type. The value for this key is application/JSON. This means that the data we send to the API and receive from it would be in the form of JSON. Next key is the token. For its value, we are sending our unique token. You will need to give the token that you will get in the next text chapter. Make sure you copy the token correctly. Also, if you notice, both the keys and values are of string type. And then, finally, we return this, which is then sent to the API. So, we have written the code for sending the header content. Click Next whenever you are ready.